You're listening to the NASM-CPT Podcast with Rick Richey, the official podcast of the National Academy of Sports Medicine.
Welcome to the NASM-CPT Podcast. My name is Rick Richey, and I want to say thank you so much for listening and tuning in. Today, I'm going to talk about some pathologies, and the pathologies that I'm talking about specifically today are going to be more about increasing or things that are in the way of activities of daily living, so kind of more orthopedic in nature. But then we'll follow up with another episode that talks about other pathologies that are more like the big main killers in our population, so heart disease and cancer and strokes and diabetes and other things like that. So I want to talk about all of those things and just to give you an understanding of what they are. So today I'm going to talk more about kind of activities of daily living and how pain can get in the way of movement, and that can then lead to some of the other pathologies that become more increase your morbidity and mortality rate. So when I say activities of daily living, it refers to a set of common everyday tasks that you can perform, and it requires self-care and independent living. So if that self-care and independent living is in place and you can take care of yourself and you can function, then you have these activities of daily living. And then those can go more in depth into things like, well, am I able to play the sports that I like to play? And those are my activities of daily living. But what we're looking at more right now is just in terms of independent living and self-care. So you could think about this sometimes in terms of aging populations, though we all know that there are many people in aging populations that have incredible activity kind of threshold that they can live, move, function in. And there are people that are quite young that have a very difficult time with self-care and independent living. So I wouldn't pigeonhole that, but understand that this could lead into a conversation about what it means for the aging population, and then certainly the baby boomer population, which is getting older, and they're getting to a space where things can be more challenging orthopedically for them, and then more contraindications and morbidity and mortality factors start to increase with age. But I got to shout out to the boomers that have done such a good job for the most part in terms of self-care and being very active and being a group that is showing that, I would say that populations before them, it wasn't quite as popular to actually exercise, but when they were in formative years and they're moving into the workplace, there's a term that came out called aerobics that did not exist, that was created by the Cooper Institute, and a lot of study about exercise started coming out, and they took to it quite well, and so I applaud them for that. We're going to talk about activities of daily living, and for a fairly active population, ADLs can include the ability to do needed or desired activities without fear of pain. So if that's the case, I'm lost. I get some musculoskeletal pain, but we're talking about musculoskeletal pain such as arthritis, and there are two kind of forms of arthritis that we'll look at, so osteoarthritis and rheumatoid arthritis, and I want you to know what those are and what the differences are. And then injury from bone density issues, back pain, and these kind of orthopedic issues that can get in the way and start to increase risk factors for other pathologies. So I want to read this to you. It's kind of a relatively lengthy quote, but stay with me. This is James Campbell, MD, and professor of neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. So I'm going to read this quote. Consumers have often had low expectations for pain treatment, but that is changing as a large portion of our population, the baby boom generation, moves into years where chronic pain from such sources as arthritis and low back pain is so very common. Having terrible pain is not good for people. It influences all aspects of life: mood, concentration, motor performance, sleep, social relations. New evidence indicates that pain affects the immune system such that cancer cells appear to grow faster when they are in pain. being a stoic and putting up with severe pain is not necessarily good for patients. Now, that quote I thought was so powerful on so many levels. When you look at the pain influences mood and concentration and motor performance and sleep and social relationships, but you also look at the indications that pain affects the immune system, and cancer cells appear to proliferate when there is pain present. That is eye-opening. And so I don't think our job, I know our job as personal trainers, it's not to mitigate pain. It's not. But there are people who don't see us and because they are in pain, and that lack of physical activity can also lead to increased pathologies in other ways. So I think that it's important to point it out, and also because we can help with movement. And if we can help people move better, oftentimes that will help with pain and help to mitigate that pain. So musculoskeletal issues may range from general joint aches and pains to fused vertebrae, hip, knee replacements, along with osteo and rheumatoid arthritis. So let's talk about osteoarthritis. Here we go. OA, or osteoarthrosis, or degenerative joint disease. So if you've ever heard somebody say, oh, I have a degenerative joint disease, that sounds so scary, right? But it's arthritis. That's what arthritis is. So osteoarthritis is caused by the breakdown of cartilage, which is the cushion between joints, and it causes the bone to rub against each other, and that creates stiffness and pain. There's also an interesting word I want to share with you. It's called eburnation, and that's the conversion of bone into a hard ivory-like mass occurring at the site of the cartilage erosion. And so what happens is that these bones rub together, and they do more than ossify, like they're already bones, right? But now it becomes really shiny and hard, and then from that, little pieces start to poke out of the edges, and those are called osteophytes. And osteophytes are also known as bone spurs. You've probably heard that before, and they're bony projections that grow from around the joint margins, and often a result of eburnation, which is a major cause of OA pain. And you can imagine the osteophytes, or these pointy little pieces of bone, are sticking out, and they're pushing into the synovium. They're poking into different areas of the body and soft tissue that are creating inflammation. And so you have this constant inflammation that could be going on. And you got this term called spinal stenosis, which is the narrowing of the space between the opening of the spinal nerves. And I think a lot of times when people think about back issues, they think about the protrusion or extrusion and different things of the disc in between the vertebrae that sit on top of each other. But a lot of times the issue are coming because there are little foramina, like little holes at the nerves from the spine, right? So you've got the brain, and you get the spinal cord, and then you've got all the branches of the nerves coming out of the spinal cord. And if that foramina narrows, and it can put pressure against the nerve, and that can create pain as well. So OA affects about 21 million Americans, and most often exhibited in the hands, the knees, hips, and let's throw shoulders in there as well. So primary OA, primary osteoarthritis, is generally associated with aging and the wear and tear of life. The older you are, the more likely you're going to have some degree of primary osteoarthritis. However, not everyone gets it, not even the very old, and that's because OA is a disease and not part of the normal aging process. Now, secondary osteoarthritis, I can speak to personally, and it develops relatively early in life, typically 10 or more years after a specific cause, such as an injury or obesity. And so mine was from a knee injury from tumbling. So that led to a couple surgeries, and then the development of what's called secondary OA. And other causes may be hereditary and muscle weakness and imbalance. What about rheumatoid arthritis then? So we've heard that there's osteoarthritis and there's rheumatoid arthritis, but what's the difference between those two? And so RA, rheumatoid arthritis, is idiopathic. And if you've ever heard the term idiopathic, pathic is pathology, right? And idio is idiot. And that's where that word comes from. And it just means I don't know what causes the pathology. So if you ever speak with a doctor and the doctor comes out and they said, I want to let you know your loved one has an idiopathic illness, and that just means nobody knows what that illness came from, why it started, where it comes from. So it's idiopathic. It's an inflammatory autoimmune disease where the synovium, which is the thin membrane that aligns the joints, gets attacked by your body's immune system. So your immune system sees its own tissues, which is what an autoimmune disease is, sees its own tissues as something foreign and begins to attack it. So idiopathic, we just don't know, and autoimmune, we're attacking ourselves because your own tissues are seen as a bacteria or a virus or a fungus. So ACSM in their third edition of Exercise Management for Persons with Chronic Disease and Disability says improvement in cardiovascular status, neuromuscular fitness, flexibility, and general health status, improved aerobic capacity, endurance, strength, and flexibility are associated with improved function, decreased joint swelling and pain, and increased social and physical activities in daily life, and reduced depression and anxiety. So what's that saying? Moving and exercising actually is very indicated for people with rheumatoid arthritis. Rheumatoid arthritis is always bilateral. That means if you get RA in your knee, then you're going to have it in your other knee. If you get it in your fingers on your right hand, you're going to have it in your fingers in your left hand. It's always bilateral. Hands, there's something called the pips. So the pips, and those are the interphalangeal joints. So these are the dips, and these are the pips. The dips are at the very end, and the pips are in the middle of the fingers. And the MP joints, which is the metatarsal phalangeal joints, which are kind of what we think about as the knuckles in the hands. And that's where they tend to take place. You also get this ulnar deviation of the fingers. So if you ever see people with their hands and they look like their fingers are fanning out towards their ulnar side, then they likely have rheumatoid arthritis. And then those pips and the MP joints, those are the ones where you see the large knuckles. And the large knuckles that you see are oftentimes quite a telltale sign of rheumatoid arthritis. Wrist, elbows, knees, ankles, and metatarsophalangeals tend to be what gets most common with rheumatoid arthritis. So be careful with working with your RA clients, and definitely be careful if there's a flare-up, because a flare-up means that they are in very severe acute pain, and exercise would not be indicated during that time. So it's good to bring their inflammation down, and then they can start moving again. And then the movement will help. Also, say this, the research is pretty clear with the osteoarthritis as well, that even though people say, I don't want to work out, I don't want to do this, it hurts my knee, exercise hurts my knee. The research is really wonderfully clear that actually exercise and movement for the joints affected with osteoarthritis also helps to minimize pain. So it's better to move it than to not move it. I think our concern is that my knee hurts and I don't want to move, but when you move, your knee won't hurt as much. So it is important. So here are the things to think about when you're working with clients with arthritis, with RA or OA. You got to do an assessment, and you have to begin and progress slowly. And I know that a lot of people are in a high intensity world right now, but we got to get people moving, and we can't scare them off, especially if they have some of these pathologies. So avoid rapid or repetitive movements and limit impacts of the affected joints, right? So you don't want to be boxing a lot with people that have affected joints in their elbows and shoulders, and you want to be careful about jumping and landing for people who are affected in the lower extremity or the low back. So a health and fitness practitioner should monitor the progress of the client and assess the effects of the exercise program on joint pain. So that just means, let's do this exercise, and you got to track it, and you got to get back to me, because if we're doing something and that flares you up, I know that we're not going to do that anymore. So we got to take that off the table. Treadmill walking's good. Stationary bikes, rowers, low impact, steps, aerobics. These are all things that, are mild, and you can do it with low impact, minimal impact, 3 to 5 days a week. Just keep moving. And you can start at stage 1 on that continuum we have of cardio, but people, they can be progressed to stage 2 and even stage 3. And if they need to be regressed, certainly regress them. But you just want to start slowly, but you don't want to keep them bound at something where they can certainly move past and not be affected by. So your assessments, do your pushing and pulling assessment, overhead squat, single leg squat assessment, and if those things are tolerated. If they're not tolerated, that is the answer to the assessment, right? So you have somebody do an overhead squat, and it's fine, then they do one squat on a single leg and it hurts. Guess what? That's the answer to the assessment. Now stop that assessment and don't do it again. Maybe down the road, if they can do a single leg squat in the future, that's the answer to your reassessment, which is we were able to progress you. Flexibility, if SMR is tolerated or, myofascial techniques can be done, like foam rolling, if it's tolerated, then do it. Static stretching is good. Active stretching is good. Resistance training, you can go higher repetitions, but I would say, be careful with overuse of anything. So minimize your sets. Maybe keep it at 1 to 2 sets, and then check in with your clients, and avoid heavy lifting high repetitions and reactive and plyo training, especially in the beginning, until you know what they're capable of. All right, cool. So let's move on to the next one. We're going to talk about osteoporosis and osteopenia. And then after we talk about these two, we'll wrap up with the bone things that we're trying to address today. So osteopenia is the decrease in the calcification or bone density, as well as reduced bone mass. Now, osteoporosis, so osteopenia is like the stepping stone for osteoporosis. And then osteoporosis is a condition in which there's a decrease in bone mass and density, as well as an increase in the space between bones, resulting in fragility and increased porousness. So it's most prevalent in postmenopausal women. That's who it's most prevalent in. But it's not uncommon in others, including men. So we're not going to take men out of the list here. And it commonly affects the femoral neck and the lumbar vertebrae. So when we say a femoral neck, so the femur is a really long bone, but once you get kind of to the top of the bone, it makes a shape almost like a cane, and then the ball of the femur goes into the hip joint. So that little section that goes from the femur to that ball is called the neck, and that's where a lot of people get hurt. And we've actually got some research that shows some concerning things to address. So the risk of hip fracture doubles every 5 years in postmenopausal women older than 50. Affects more than 25 million people each year, resulting in 1.5 million hip fractures. Of these 1.5 million, only 20% of patients return to normal functioning status. That's pretty low. Those that resistance train have higher bone mineral density than others. And so resistance training is highly indicated, first of all, in the prevention of osteopenia and osteoporosis, but it is helpful in treating it. You're not going to necessarily get more bone mineral density back necessarily, but it can definitely slow the process. Resistance training may only increase that bone mineral density by up to 5%, but it's likely ineffective in preventing fractures, and since you're already there. So fall prevention rather than strengthening alone is probably more advantageous, with a focus on flexibility, core, and balance training. Also read something else interesting about osteoporosis, and at a certain age, and I can't remember what it was, but once a hip fracture or a break takes place at a certain age, then that rate of other pathologies starting to kick in skyrockets. And I wish I had that statistic in front of me. And so when we talk in one of the next episodes about other pathologies like heart disease and things like that, then you understand why pain is such a pain, because it gets in the way of your movement. And so you see this increased sedentary lifestyle in an older population or an injured population. And that then leads to the proliferation of other physiological issues. All right, so what is the programming like? All right, what are some of the protocols for osteoporosis? So I think treadmill with handrail support. So for people who are certainly having issues and fear of falling, 2 to 5 days a week is super important. Intensity. I mean, let's go in stage 1, beginning phases, but certainly you can be progressed up to stage 2, and we can work on increasing VO2 max. Duration, like 30 to 60 minutes, but you may need to put this in bouts, right? So it may need to be, think about it like an 8 to 10 minute bout of exercise and then a solid break and a solid rest. People who are doing this on their own might want to say, hey, let's exercise, just focus on exercising for 10 minutes, 8 minutes, and then, break for an hour, have some, time to yourself, and then come back, but repeat that number so you can get 6 out of the day for 60 minutes if you're doing it for 10 minutes. I know that may sound like a lot, but for some people, that's a lot better than committing to straight up 60 minutes of exercise. And you want to do the same assessment, similar anyway, like a push and a pull assessment, overhead squat assessment, and then a sit to chair and stand assessment might be something that's beneficial because it gives you an idea of where they are with their neuromuscular control, their balance, their core. And then with flexibility, static stretching is good, active stretching is good. Resistance training, 1 to 3 sets, 8-20 repetitions, and 2 to 3 times a week. Phases 1 and 2 should really be mastered before moving anywhere farther in the OPT model. So get the OPT model, phases 1 and 2 before considering going ahead. And then special considerations. You start slow, just monitor everything, and look at their postural control, and exercises need to be progressed, if possible, towards free sitting and standing, so they're not, they don't have back support, and then hopefully not butt support. They are able to get neuromuscular control of their body and do some more standing exercises. Careful and avoid spinal loading, so maybe like the back squats, you want to be careful with, just because loading the spine for people with osteoporosis could be incredibly challenging and potentially contraindicated. And then look at ensuring normal breathing, and that just means controlling your breath and avoiding things like the Valsalva maneuver, which is holding your breath and closing everything off. So anyway, this I find very interesting. I think focusing on this is going to give you a little bit of light, and hopefully, if you're not entirely sure what osteoporosis was, or osteopenia, rheumatoid arthritis, and osteoarthritis, it gives you a better idea of what these pathologies are, and get an idea at least of what it is, how to have a conversation about it, understanding clients that may have issues that you're not that familiar with, and it may prompt you to look a little bit deeper into how do I connect with my clients who have these pathologies, and when you can engage with them on that level, because I don't know if you've ever been around, let's just say older people talking, and sometimes it's like a one-upper game of who's got the most pain. So I'd love for any of the clients that you have say, I used to be in a lot of pain, but then I started exercising, and now I can't play your one-upper game in terms of orthopedic pain, but I can play your one-upper game in terms of how many push-ups can you get. So anyway, hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to tag me if you're listening. You're going to repost anything. It's at dr.rickrichy on Instagram, and then hit us up at NASM Fitness as well. And hopefully we'll tune in next week. Thanks.